Thanks to a listener request, we're actually going to go back and tell you the story of a player that actually was on the receiving end of Tony Romo's first NFL pass. He was a part of the Cowboys, part of the Bears. But in 2011, he was arrested for trying to purchase and distribute large amounts of cocaine and marijuana. It was a scene pretty much right out of a movie where authorities had the restaurant surrounded, had undercover agents inside. They handed off a bag, all that stuff for the takedown in Chicago. We'll tell you the story today of Sam Hurd, who is currently serving a 15-year prison sentence.
This is Distant Replay.
It's another true crime edition of the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Again, you can find us online, distantreplaypodcast.com, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, of course. Thanks for subscribing, rating, reviewing us over the last week since we talked last, but we're glad to get into another true crime edition of the podcast. I'm Ben George. He's Mike Noto, the true crime guy on the show, and he's got another good one for us today. It's Sam Hurd. And as I said in the intro, Mike, Sam Hurd has some kind of memorable moments in the NFL. I mean, he's not a guy that fans are going to be talking about for a long time, but he's a guy that probably most people remember the name.
Yeah, I think most people will remember Sam Hurd because he played a role on some Dallas Cowboy teams that were very highly publicized. And I think most people even know that Sam Hurd got in trouble. But our goal here is to fill in the details on what happened.
So that's what we'll do today on the podcast, and we'll jump right into it. As we always do, we start off with some background on the person, where they're from, college, that sort of thing, before we get into the crimes.
Yeah, so Hurd is from San Antonio, Texas, went to Brackenridge High School. As you might expect, he was a very good athlete. Football, basketball, track. His senior year, he was an all-state selection in the state of Texas, which, as we know, Texas high school football, definitely nothing to sneeze at.
Right.
He grew up in a rough neighborhood, but by all accounts, he grew up in a very good family. His mother was very active in keeping him on the straight and narrow, and he did stay out of trouble during his childhood. Anyone I read about that talked about Sam Hurd, nothing but good things to say about him. From Brackenridge High School in San Antonio, he ended up at Northern Illinois playing football.
Okay.
Now, I guess Northern Illinois, I obviously guilty as charged. I don't follow them that much, but I guess they were, back in the day when Sam Hurd went there, they were mostly a running team. They evolved towards the pass a little bit more when Sam was a senior, and he had his best season. He had 60 catches for over 1,000 yards in his senior year, ended up finishing in top 5 in all the receiving categories at that school. So that led to him being one of these prospects that was a fringe guy that could be drafted, but likely he wouldn't be drafted, one of those type of prospects. So he ends up signing with the Cowboys as an undrafted free agent, and he played with the Cowboys from 2006 to 2010. Now, this is going to be where most people remember him from. He was a backup receiver, and he was actually slated, I believe, going into the 08 or 09 season to be a starter opposite Terrell Owens.
Yeah.
But Hurd got injured, which opened the door to Miles Austin having that breakout season. Remember when Miles Austin came out of nowhere from Monmouth and had a great season?
Big fantasy guy.
Yep, and Miles Austin parlayed that into a huge contract. Hurd would never really develop as the receiver in Dallas, but he was a top-flight special teams player. So one of these guys that, at any given moment could be the 3rd, 4th, or 5th receiver, but was very valuable on their special teams squad. So in the NFL, when you're holding those guys in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th receiver spots, you want them to be able to contribute on special teams.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of player Hurd was.
Okay.
So on the heels of that, being productive, mostly in a special teams role with the Cowboys, he signed a 3-year contract with the Bears in 2011, worth about $5 million. They brought him in more as a special teams guy first and foremost, so much so that he was named their special teams captain. All right?
Okay.
Hurd signed with the Cowboys in the offseason in 2011. If you remember, Ben, that was the year of the lockout.
Right.
The only reason I mention that is because that kind of plays a role in his crime story, which we'll get to in a second. The Bears cut Sam Hurd on December 16, 2011, and we'll get into now on why that happened.
So Hurd, I guess he was pretty well known around Dallas too, right? I mean, this is a guy that, is an NFL guy. If you're a really big fan, you probably remembered him, at least a couple of his moments and as he was becoming kind of that starter. But I think in Dallas, he's a pretty big deal. He actually co-hosted a radio show with Tony Romo, and a TV show, I think, with Terrell Owens down there during his time. So he was pretty well known and a pretty big name.
Big name, like you mentioned, he hosted those. He did appear in the media with Owens and Romo, like you mentioned. Very well liked by his teammates.
Yeah.
That will go, even what we're about to go through, what happened to him, even through all that, his teammates had nothing but great things to say about him.
Okay, so pretty good guy, pretty successful, I mean, relatively speaking. And now we move into what he gets in trouble for. So I'm interested just to hear kind of how this develops, because he's got a background that seems to be pretty normal, right? We kind of hear most guys kind of follow this trajectory, so kind of surprised that it took a turn.
Yeah, so this is a very, very, again, I knew the rough details of his story, but not really the full, how like you see a guy get arrested, and it's like, all right, what's the story behind the story? And that's kind of what I focus my research on here. So just to sort of lay everything out for you guys, where everything started for him in terms of his issues was he developed, by his own admission, a dependency on marijuana. All right.
Okay.
And him using marijuana in large quantities started after he sustained some of those injuries I talked about with the Cowboys. Like, it was one of those things where he always used marijuana, but it ramped up a lot when he had to deal with pain from injuries, he says, and also just the general stresses of, going to work every day and having to perform to keep his job. During his time with the Cowboys, he was having marijuana shipped from California to Dallas.
Wow.
To the tune of 2 to 10 pounds per shipment.
Ooh.
Now, he never sold it, never made any money on it. It was just the kind of thing where he shared it with his friends, teammates, and we know that it was not a money-making venture for him, because Homeland Security and ICE would do like a 2-year investigation on him in regards to this marijuana in particular, and found no evidence of him making money on it. That it was more a thing where he bought a lot of it because, by his own admission, like I said, he was addicted to it, and then also shared it with his friends and teammates. Okay?
Okay.
So that sort of sets the scene for the summer of 2011. Like I mentioned, there was a lockout in the NFL. All right? Hurd was still living in Texas. If you remember that year, Ben, what happened was they were waiting for the lockout to get settled. And we were like in late July, mid-late July. It still hadn't been settled, but like a settlement was imminent. Mm-hmm. So what that led to is a whole bunch of free agents, including Sam Hurd, all being signed within like 2 or 3 days right before training camp.
Okay.
All right. So Hurd is in like this state of limbo here. During the summer of 2011, during the lockout, he's still living in Texas. And because he doesn't know where he's going to be or what city he's going to be in next, he's in a rush to get a shipment of that weed delivered to him so he could have it for him when the lockout ended.
Okay. His
dealer was from California. So his dealer made his way out to Texas to deliver him his marijuana. So basically, such a large shipment, let's say, in the 20, 25, 10, 15 pound range, that this guy was going to deliver it to Hurd. Okay. While in Texas, his dealer from California gets arrested for marijuana possession. He's at a hotel, his dealer and his friends, and the dealer, someone reports, the smell of weed coming from a room. Him and the dealer and his friends get arrested for marijuana possession. Hurd wants to keep himself distanced from the situation, but makes the decision to send one of his friends to bail them out, right?
Okay.
This is on July 26th. Now, he thinks he's distancing himself from this situation, but the authorities already confiscated the phones of the people who were arrested. So behind the scenes, the law enforcement is connecting the dots between Sam Hurd and these people from California. And what made them alarmed by what they found in the hotel room was there wasn't just a little bit of weed in the room. There was like a lot of cash in the room also.
Okay.
So they were looking into these people for more than just a simple marijuana possession charge. All right. This all starts the authorities, like I said, being interested in Hurd and what he's up to. All right. Simultaneously on that same day, July 26, 2011, Hurd gets approached by one of his friends, a guy named Toby Lujan, about he basically tells Hurd, look, I have a cousin that's involved in Mexican drug dealing with a cartel, and I could flip your money and make you a quick profit. So what Lujan basically said was, I could turn your $88,000, which is what he asked for specifically, I could turn that into a profit for you plus interest in 2 or 3 days, kind of like a quick flip of his money.
Okay.
All right. Hurd said he probably knew whatever he was going to flip his money, whatever activity he was going to flip his money with, he knew that it had to do with drugs, but said he didn't know it had anything to do with cocaine. That's Hurd's standpoint. Lujan would later say, Hurd approached me about getting involved in cocaine dealing, and he knew exactly what he was giving me the money for. Okay?
Okay. Conflicting
But Hurd's
stories.
story is, I didn't ask any questions. I probably should have. I knew it was going to be used for something shady, but I didn't ask.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah. Okay.
Hurd says, this guy Lujan was how he knew Lujan was, Lujan worked on his vehicles a lot. He worked at like an auto service garage. And Hurd said, look, I knew this guy didn't make a lot of money. I became friends with him over the years because he helped me a lot with me and my family's cars while I lived in Dallas. And I thought it was an opportunity to help him out. Like it was an opportunity for me to take $88,000 that I had, give it to him to flip it. I make a little bit of money. He makes a little bit of money. He needs it. I was trying to be a good friend. So this leads to then the next day, July 27th, Toby takes the $88,000 and drives an Escalade registered to Hurd's family to this meetup where he's going to pay for drugs. Authorities find out from an informant that Toby is looking to buy kilos of cocaine and get told where the drop-off point is. Before Toby gets to the drop-off point, they pull him over and they find the $88,000 in a duffel bag. So it looks suspicious to law enforcement, obviously. Mm-hmm. What are you doing traveling around with $88,000 in cash? Plus, they know from the informant of the meeting. Toby says it's Sam Hurd's. He always keeps large amounts of cash like this in his vehicle. The agents kept the $88,000, downloaded Lujan's phone records, and let him go.
Okay.
Okay, so they let him go. What do you think the first thing Lujan does is?
He probably gets in touch with his buddy.
He calls Sam Hurd right away, which prompts Sam Hurd to call the agents that afternoon. The next day, Sam Hurd drives to their office to meet them in person. He tells them, hey, look, the bag is, that's my bag. That's my money. I'm buying my mother a house, which was actually true. I was going to use that money, to go towards the down payment. That's why I was in a bag in the back of my family's truck. And Toby is a friend of mine, and I let him borrow the car. All right?
Okay. Makes sense.
While he's talking to the agents, literally, he gets a call from his agent. Now, the lockout had ended like the day before or 2 days before. And he gets a call from his agent, and his agent says, hey, look, the Bears just made you a very good 3-year contract offer. You have to fly to Chicago and sign it. Right? This is literally when he's meeting with the law enforcement officials. He leaves the office without his cash. The law enforcement is basically not buying his story, essentially. He leaves the office without his cash, flies to Chicago, signs his contract. So we're going to put that to the side right now. Hurd doesn't hear anything from those law enforcement officials for months, okay, after that meeting. He doesn't get his money back, though, like I mentioned. In the coming months, Toby's trying to figure out, his friend Toby, how to make things up to Sam Hurd. He lost $88,000 of his, Mm-hmm. In the background of all this, law enforcement is connecting the dots from the hotel incident and Toby getting pulled over. There was communication between law enforcement agencies. So they're connecting the dots between the marijuana deal, between Toby getting pulled over, and Toby's cousin Manuel, who is the one that is affiliated with the drug cartel.
Yeah, the quick flip guy.
Yeah, the quick is trying all this time is trying to tell Toby, hey, look, we can do more deals and we can get Hurd his money back. And Toby's a little bit hesitant at first, and he's like, look, I don't want to screw over my friend again. We got to make sure it works this time. So Toby thinks it's best to get Hurd and Manuel on the phone so they can talk about it, okay? Now, during this time, as you can imagine, federal agents have Toby's phone tapped and have been listening to his conversations since the summer.
Yeah.
When they get word that Hurd and Manuel will be talking on the phone, they set up cameras and they set up recording devices in that auto shop where Toby worked that I mentioned before and where this conversation was going to take place. This is their chance. This is the law enforcement's chance to prove that Hurd was the money behind Toby's potential drug purchase, right? Which is what they're trying to prove. During their tapping of the phones and the conversation that takes place between Manuel and Hurd, they're able to decipher that Manuel and Hurd will be meeting in Chicago on December 14th in person to discuss Hurd buying cocaine to sell it. So in essence, Hurd's going to buy cocaine to sell it to make his $88,000 back.
Okay.
All right. The federal agents hear this on the wiretap, and they're off to Chicago, right, to be there for the meeting. It turns out this whole time that Manuel is actually an informant. And he's the one who reported Toby and led to the seizure of Hurd's money. They aren't really cousins. Toby and Manuel are not really cousins. It's just like a term of you know, you could call someone your cousin, but they're not your cousin.
Right.
Yeah. Okay? Hurd obviously has no clue about any of this in advance of the meeting with Manuel. All right? He's walking into a situation where they're trying to prove, the Fed's goal was to prove that Hurd had intentions of setting up a long-term cocaine trafficking network. So they send Manuel, along with an undercover agent who's posing as someone named Juan, to sort of get Hurd to commit to the fact that he wanted to buy large amounts of drugs with the intent to sell them. This meeting's on December 14th, 2011 at a Morton Steakhouse in Chicago.
Nice.
There's 22 law enforcement officers either in the Morton Steakhouse or outside of it.
Like a movie scene.
Yeah, like lying in a way. Exactly.
Yeah.
The guy who's getting set up doesn't know it, and he's about to walk into the steakhouse and seal his fate. You know? Hurd had like I guess the Bears were coming off like a 3-game losing streak at this time. And Hurd asked the guy, Manuel, hey, look, can we meet at my house instead of the steakhouse? Because I've had like a real stressful week. And Manuel was like, no, like we have to meet at the steakhouse because we have other business to tend to in the area, so it works better for us. All right? So they're in like a very crowded Morton Steakhouse in Chicago talking about the cartel, represented by Juan and Manuel, supplying Hurd with drugs. They talk about, in like almost a 90-minute conversation over dinner, the cartel supplying Hurd with massive amounts of drugs. Hurd actually says he always wanted to buy drugs in large quantities, but he can never find anyone who could supply him with what he needed. So he's looking at this like as like a perfect match. They discuss where he wants the drugs delivered, you know, because they're coming from Mexico. So they say, hey, look, it'd be cheaper if we go to Dallas, more expensive if we have to bring them up to Chicago. Hurd says, hey, I want them delivered to Chicago, and they agree on a price of, I think it was like $25,000 per kilo, right? So they're negotiating a deal essentially here.
Yeah.
Which is what the feds want to hear. This is where Hurd gets tripped up, okay? 2 things. He verbally says he can buy 5 kilos a week immediately, 10 kilos in the coming weeks, and eventually he wants to get up to 50 kilos a week.
Jeez.
Because he says that's how much demand there is. Like, as soon as I get this stuff, I can just sell it. That, and he also just unsolicited asked them if they could also supply him with weed to the tune of 500 to 1,000 pounds per week.
Damn. It's a lot of weed.
So that's the first thing that sort of, you know, they would use against Hurd later at trial.
Okay.
With his charges. The second thing is, in order to really solidify their case, the feds needed Hurd to take drugs from Manuel and Juan, like during the meeting. So they come up with this plan where Juan and Manuel bring a happy birthday bag. You know, you can meet someone out for dinner, you get them a birthday present, and you put it in a bag that says happy birthday.
Okay.
So they come up with this plan to put a kilo of Coke underneath like wrapping paper or the filler paper you put in a gift bag.
Right, yeah.
And they basically tell them, hey, look, this is just like look, this is the kind of cocaine that we supply. It's in this bag. Take it with you. Think of this as an advance, and you can pay us back at a later date. They had to be careful not to give it to him, but to present it as like a part of their transaction. Okay. Hurd ends up taking the bag. What Hurd doesn't know, obviously, is that they're in a crowded dining room and that the 3 men sitting right next to him, I mentioned there was 22 members of law enforcement, either in or outside of the restaurant. The people sitting right next to him, dressed in suits, they look like they're, who knows,
businessmen in Chicago.
Business people. They're undercover agents, and they've been recording the entire conversation they've been having for almost the last hour and a half.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
Hurd gets up, goes to his car, and is arrested on the spot. Right? Now, what they're arresting him for is that he had the intention to basically start running a very large-scale cocaine trafficking network. Not that he was dealing massive amounts of cocaine. You know what I'm saying? Not yet.
Yeah, right.
But that he had the intentions based on his conversations with these two guys about setting up a long-term cocaine trafficking network. And, of course, he ended up taking the bag with the drugs in it. The Bears released him the next day, as you would expect. What I found interesting is I found press conference footage from 3 players, Brian Urlacher, Lance Briggs, and Roy Williams, who actually played with him in Dallas and then played with him also in Chicago. And they all had nothing but very good things to say about him, and they were shocked about what happened. Like he was almost like they at the time they were like, I can't believe this guy was supposedly living this double life, and we had no clue about it. We've had nothing but good experiences with him. On January 4th, 2012, he and Toby are indicted. Hurd pled not guilty to the charges of setting up a drug dealing network. All right. Now, in between his indictment and pleading, which I just mentioned, and his sentencing, or his trial rather, he failed 2 drug tests, and in August of 2012 was ordered to be jailed immediately. He was previously out on bond, okay, awaiting the federal trial for the drug trafficking.
Yeah.
This caused him in April of 2013 to change his plea to guilty. Right? So he just says, I'm guilty.
Right.
Also in the background, in between his indictment and sentencing, he had a cousin who was involved in drug dealing, and those California weed dealers, remember that got caught in the hotel?
Yep.
They sort of come to the forefront because of other trouble they were in and try to use implicating Sam Hurd more in drug dealing as a way to sort of get their sentences lightened or get their sentences erased. The cousin accuses him of giving him money to stake him in a drug deal. The weed dealers, say that Sam was into much more than just buying weed, that he tried to buy cocaine from them also.
Okay.
It was unclear to me whether this impacted his sentencing at all, but I don't think it did. I think they took what these guys had to say with a grain of salt when all was said and done, that they investigated their claims and nothing much came from it.
Yeah.
But just something to add,
Okay.
In November of 2013 is when he was sentenced. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judge took into account the fact that he had a nonviolent history. This is the first thing of this magnitude, certainly, he's ever even been mentioned in.
Right.
So he's sentenced to 15 years when he could have received like life in prison. Okay.
Okay.
Because of the sheer amount of drugs he was talking about buying. He didn't buy them. He's slated to be released in 2025 because he has to serve at least 85% of his sentence. So it's a federal drug sentence. So he has to serve at least 85% of that. So he's slated to be released in 2025. Toby ended up getting 41 months in prison.
Wow.
So I just thought this was a crazy story because I had thought he ran this large drug operation for years and that they caught him and he was a drug dealer.
Yeah.
It turns out those aren't even the charges that he got convicted of. He got convicted of trying to set up, in their eyes, this massive drug dealing ring. And he did so right in the middle of a very, what I would consider, based on NFL career standards, a very productive NFL career. That was, if you look at the span of an NFL career, he was like right in his prime.
Yeah.
And that all kind of went up in flames. And like I said, he's serving 15 years in prison. So hopefully this kind of fills in the gaps for people. Sam Hurd still says, he pled guilty, but his story all along was that, he was doing all this for Toby to get his foot in the door to buy the drugs. Then he was going to step back and let Toby sort of handle the actual day-to-day of the drug dealing operation. Not that makes it any better, but that was his story, that he was kind of doing it more for his friend, and it ended up spiraling out of control.
Yeah. I mean, I can kind of see how that could be the case. And it just, this is one of those stories where, and it's ultimately up to, Hurd and whoever the player is to be responsible for their own actions. So I'm not giving them a pass, but you see this a lot with guys and family and trying to help people out, and ends up backfiring on them. Not saying that he's not at fault at all, but you see who you surround yourself with ends up playing a big part of your success or your failure in many cases, and that seems to be what happened here. But that's pretty wild how they kind of set him up like that. So essentially, like, they were like, we got to get him on tape, got to get him buying it, and then we need to get him to take this bag from us. Hey, deal's done. Here's a little something to sample on your way out. Is kind of a, hey, here's a Ford. You can kind of get rid of this as you want to now, and then we'll just, it'll be part of your next shipment or something like that. So,
yeah, exactly. They had to make it clear that was like a part of the business deal. They weren't giving it to him.
They can't trap him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then one other thing of note was when this story came out, the headline was what I mentioned at the top, towards the top of when I was going over his crimes, where he supplied his teammates with weed. That was the headline coming out of this. And I was expecting to hear a lot more about his teammates, when in reality, those headlines were a little bit misleading, because while he did supply his teammates with marijuana, it was more like, I bought marijuana, I have some, I can't smoke at all. Do you guys want some?
Right.
Like, he didn't make money off them.
Like for us, it's like we bought a bunch of beer and we got it in the fridge. Hey, you guys want to come over and drink? Kind of thing.
The players were not like involved in anything else. And the headlines from back in the day, I think, sort of insinuated that maybe a little bit. Mm-hmm. But they, no players were linked to anything he was doing with the cocaine at all.
Yeah, and that's something that who even cares about now with marijuana on the verge of just being legalized in most places, and really nobody even thinks twice about it now. It's not even that big of an issue, but the cocaine, obviously, a much bigger deal. But interesting story on Sam Hurd. So he could be out, I guess, in just a few years. Looks like to be the case. So very interesting. Crazy that he's almost served that entire sentence and don't really know that much about the case. But that's what we try to do here on the show, is fill you in on the details on some of these cases and what happened, and let you research it more if you want. And I'm sure there's plenty of places to find info on this, right, Mike?
Yeah, there is. SI did a pretty lengthy article on it in regards to his crimes and his trial. You can find numerous news clips on the internet, news stories, because, again, this happened, between 2011 and 2013. So there's a lot of internet coverage on it.
Good deal. Well, that'll do it for us here on Distant Replay. Thanks again for listening. Please subscribe, rate and review, tell a friend, spread the word. If you like these true crimes, want to hear about somebody specifically, let us know that as well. We'll put it on the list. Mike does a lot of research on these, so he'll put them on there and add it to you. We got another good one coming out, a two-parter coming out pretty soon. That's pretty wild, so look forward to that. Plus, we got games we're still watching. Al Davis doc we just went back and recapped as well, plus our first What If is coming soon too. So a lot on the docket for Distant Replay, and we hope you continue to follow along. Thanks.